I guess I should open by saying that I'm not going to provide an answer to the question that is the title of my talk. This was originally a much longer presentation, about 40 or 50 minutes, that I've condensed down into 20 minutes. And in doing that, I ended up deciding to focus mostly on what was the motivation for the longer talk. And essentially what I'm going to discuss here is why mainstream psychiatry, and specifically mainstream approaches to psychiatric diagnosis and classification, what we see in like the DSM-5, for instance, why mainstream psychiatry doesn't provide answers to this kind of question, like what is depressed mood, and why it also doesn't really provide answers to questions like what is major depressive disorder. I don't think that's the role that those manuals are meant to play, but we often think that they do provide those answers, and as long as we think that they do, then we kind of fail to look for other resources. So essentially what I'm hoping this does is provides a kind of philosophical and theoretical motivation for turning to alternative approaches like phenomenological psychopathology. And I'll use depressed mood, of course, as the primary example here. And depending on how quickly I get through this, if I have a few minutes at the end, I will talk a bit about what phenomenology has done in our conception of depressed mood, or for our conception, but I'm also happy to talk about that during the Q&A if you have further questions. Okay, so if you can't read the text on the screen, don't worry about it. I'll have the text for depressed mood on the next slide for you. But first, I think it's helpful to give an example of what we call the operational approach in contemporary psychiatry, which has been the target of criticism from phenomenologists. So I think most of the people who do work in phenomenological psychopathology, or many of them, haven't explicitly criticized contemporary approaches to psychiatric diagnosis and classification, but those who have explicitly criticized it focus primarily on the problems associated with what we call the operational approach in psychiatry. And operationalism has its history going all the way back to like physics in the early 1900s, but operationalism was developed in that field. It then made its way through philosophy of science and then back into psychiatry, so it has a strange, convoluted history about how it's made its way into psychiatry. But we also don't really need to pay attention to the history right now, because operationalism as it's practiced in psychiatry has almost nothing to do with its original development in physics. So essentially, when psychiatrists say that they use an operational approach, what they mean is that they use basically checklist diagnostic methods that rely on easily observable signs and symptoms. So in the case of diagnosing major depressive disorder, for instance, which is the example that I have right here, to be diagnosed with major depressive disorder, there are 9 possible symptoms. Actually, some of those symptoms include multiple symptoms, but for the sake of simplicity, we can say there's 9 possible symptoms, and you have to exhibit at least 5 of those 9 over the same 2-week period. And then among those 5, at least one of them has to be one of the first 2 criteria. The first one is depressed mood. The second is diminished interest or pleasure, which we sometimes refer to as anhedonia. So any diagnosis of major depressive disorder will include at least one of those first 2, although I think many diagnoses will include both of them, both depressed mood and diminished interest or pleasure. And then there's kind of like a grab bag of other criteria. Some of them we wouldn't normally think of as being kind of centrally associated with depression, so things like significant weight loss or weight gain, insomnia, hypersomnia, psychomotor agitation and retardation. And then there are a few others that we do commonly associate more with depression, things like feelings of worthlessness or excessive guilt, or thoughts of death and suicidal ideation. So a lot of the phenomenological critique of psychiatric diagnosis and classification has focused on this kind of the atomistic nature of mainstream psychiatry, where they just give us this set of symptoms. They don't tell us anything about how the symptoms are connected, or whether they're connected, or why they arise together, or sometimes don't arise together. There's no attempt to find what phenomenologists refer to sometimes as a core gestalt, so some kind of core feature of the disorder around which all the other symptoms and features are organized or orbit. And I'm going to then turn, in a couple slides, I'll get to this, where I'm going to focus on one aspect of operationalism that I think has only recently been criticized within philosophy of psychiatry, but still I think hasn't really received much attention from phenomenologists who are critical of psychiatric classifications or current approaches. Although I think it's in the background of a lot of the work that they have done in their critiques of operationalism. And I think this problem comes out, the problem of indexing, as I'll call it, This problem comes out when we look at some of the specific diagnostic criteria, especially when we look at depressed mood and how that's described in the DSM. So this is the text from the first criterion you can use for the diagnosis of major depressive disorder. And it just says, depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day, as indicated by either subjective report. For example, someone might report that they feel sad, empty, or hopeless, or by observation made by others. For example, the person might appear tearful. And then in children and adolescents, it can be an irritable mood rather than a depressed mood. So one of the problems that arises in contemporary approaches to psychiatric classification is that when you use this operational approach and you have checklist diagnostic methods, there's no attempt to actually give a robust definition or description of the disorder within the DSM, right? So the account of major depressive disorder in the DSM-5 basically consists, or most of it consists of those 9 criteria. So in that sense, what we end up with is an indication, things that indicate the presence of the disorder. But even when you look at the items that indicate the presence of the disorder, a lot of them aren't defined. We'd hope that they are. So in some cases, as Rosa pointed out, for instance, when you look at the use of delusions in the DSM, there is a definition that's given, right? It's probably a poor definition, but they at least attempt to define delusions. There's no real attempt made in the DSM, though, to define depressed mood. It just gives us a list of things that indicate that someone might have a depressed mood. And then a depressed mood, in turn, is indicative of having major depressive disorder. So we end up with kind of layers upon layers of one thing indicating another without ever saying what any of those things really are. And we end up with this really impoverished account of many of the disorders in the DSM. So they do say a little bit more about depressed mood. So for each criterion that's used in the DSM, there's a section where they'll have about a paragraph that elaborates upon that. So in the case of depressed mood, they also say that people might report feeling depressed, no surprise there, or feeling discouraged or feeling down in the dumps. And in addition to this, they might report that they feel blah, that they have no feelings, or they feel anxious. And all of these things are to some degree indicative of having depressed mood. So I think Kenneth Kendler, who is kind of sympathetic with phenomenological research but does not do phenomenology himself, he's given the best characterization of this problem that I've seen. So in an article from a few years ago, he asks, how should DSM criteria relate to the disorders they are designed to assess? I suggest that US psychiatry as a field has tended to reify DSM criteria. This approach reflects a conceptual error, a category mistake. That mistake is taking an index of a thing for the thing itself. Now, I think he slightly overstates his position here. I think it'd be better to say the mistake is to take an index of a thing for a definition of a thing, or perhaps to say that the mistake is to take an index of a thing for a robust description of a thing. I don't think anyone's confusing the index with the thing itself. But anyway, to follow through on his point, I think that this problem of indexing is really one of the core problems of operationalism, or one of the core reasons why operationalism isn't something that can ever give us a kind of robust account of the disorders that we're interested in, and why we need to turn to alternative approaches. But what I'm going to do now for the next few minutes is provide this kind of strange philosophical analogy, the kind of thing that you would only give in a philosophy talk, because otherwise I think it would just seem absurd, or maybe it still seems absurd. And the point of this is just to drive home what exactly an index is and what role an index plays in psychiatry. And importantly, I want to focus on the fact that you can have a perfectly good index. You can have an index that reliably picks out exactly what you want it to pick out, or helps you identify exactly what you want it to identify. And in spite of having this index, you can still be in a position where you don't have any genuine understanding of the phenomenon that you've identified, whatever that thing might be. So here's the analogy. I'm going to use the analogy of the stop sign. So suppose that I was able to get my dream job, and my dream job is going from town to town in the US and helping them decide whether or not they need more stop signs, because I have really grand ambitions. So in this case, I'm under lockdown in the UK, so I can't go back to the US to do this work. So I have to find someone in the town that I'm doing this work for. to go around and identify all of the stop signs for me and let me know where all the stop signs are on a map. I think I'm getting feedback. Someone might be unmuted. So, sorry, can we check that? I'm still getting a lot of feedback.
I've just turned off someone's mic. It should be okay now.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so suppose that the only person I can hire to do this work for me is someone who has literally been living under a rock for 100 years. He doesn't know what cars are. He doesn't know what roads or streets are. He doesn't know anything about traffic laws or traffic signs or traffic lights or anything like that. But this is the person that I need. This is the person who's going to help me to identify all the stop signs in this town so that I can do my work. Now, one option I have is to kind of sit down and have a long conversation with him about the whole history of automobiles and roads and traffic laws and everything like that. And eventually, out of this conversation, I'll be able to describe to him what a stop sign is and what role it plays and what people are supposed to do when they see a stop sign and so on. But there's actually a much simpler option. Instead of giving him this whole historical background and context and ultimately coming to a definition of a stop sign, I could just give him an index. I could just give him a list of really basic criteria he can use. And as he walks around this town, he can use these criteria to determine whether or not an object he's looking at is or is not a stop sign. And if it is a stop sign, then he marks it on the map for me. So I might use criteria like this. I might say, anytime you see something that's red, octagonal, and says stop, that's a stop sign. I need you to mark that on the map for me. So in principle, this might work, right? He might be able to go around and fairly reliably pick out stop signs for me. But there are also cases in which I think he'll run into problems, but anyone who actually knew what a stop sign was and had a better kind of contextual awareness of what a stop sign is wouldn't run into these kinds of problems. So for instance, if he uses these criteria, he won't only identify the stop signs that are on street corners, which are the ones that I'm interested in. He might also identify stop signs that are on the sides of school buses in the US. Right? And this, of course, is not a real stop sign in a sense. It's not the kind of stop sign I'm trying to identify, but it meets all the criteria I gave him. So the natural response here, I think, isn't so much to scrap the whole idea of indexing. It's instead to qualify the index in some way, right? To add another criterion that solves this problem. So I might say something like, it also has to be on a pole. So to get a sense of kind of what this analogy means for psychiatric diagnosis and classification, let's think about why we'd select these kinds of criteria as opposed to others. The patient can very easily report to you that would be apparent to the patient upon a fairly straightforward interview, or behavioral features that you can easily observe in the patient in the diagnostic setting. Right, so there's a reason that we've focused on the features of disorders that we have. And one of the consequences of this is that, well, one of Kendler's worries, for instance, is that when people are trained to perform diagnoses and they begin to rely too much on tools like the DSM, they begin to think that the DSM actually outlines all of the relevant features of a disorder and identifies those features of the disorder that are central to the disorder that help us kind of get at the core of it. But because of the way in which indexing works and the purpose behind the criteria that were selected to be used in the DSM, there's really no reason to think that the criteria that are actually listed in there are in any way or for any reason kind of central features of the disorder in question. They just happen to be the ones that could be reliably identified in the course of a diagnostic interview. Now, I think there are good reasons for having moved to this approach and using an indexing approach. So prior to the DSM-3, which is when the operational approach began to be used in 1980, if we look at the DSM-1 and DSM-2, there's no real clear diagnostic checklists. And what's really provided are these brief descriptions or narratives about each condition. And because there weren't easy to use diagnostic checklists, we ran into the problem of low inter-rater reliability, which basically means that when people were using the DSM-1 and DSM-2 as their diagnostic manuals, if you went to multiple psychiatrists and presented with the same symptoms in each case, there's a pretty good chance you were actually going to receive different diagnoses. And once we switch to this operational approach where we use these kind of simple diagnostic checklists, then we end up with much higher inter-rater reliability. So now if you go to multiple psychiatrists and present with the same symptoms, you have a pretty good chance of receiving the same diagnosis in each case. But of course, one of the things we've sacrificed here is that we're no longer actually providing definitions of disorders. We're no longer providing kind of robust narratives about any of these disorders because we've decided to just prioritize listing those features that can be easily observed in the diagnostic clinical setting and basically ignoring everything else. And when the DSM-3 was first formulated, I think there was a fairly clear discussion of this. So there was an understanding that this was the role of the DSM. But since then, it's also become a kind of basic manual also for research. And this creates kind of weird circular problems where you don't have the resources to kind of think outside of the current diagnostic categories that are offered to us. So coming back to Kendler here, and Kendler also uses major depressive disorder as one of the key example that he has in this paper. And Kendler argues that what we really need to do here is broaden our understanding of mental disorders by considering symptoms beyond the DSM. So as he points out, there's lots of historical textbooks within the field of psychopathology that we have from over a century of research. And a lot of those, some of the discussions of major depression and other depressive disorders, for instance, some of the features discussed there do overlap with the DSM. But there are lots and lots of other features of disorders that are discussed in these textbooks that could be relevant to understanding the disorder, to providing treatments, and perhaps also to diagnosis. But they just don't happen to be mentioned in the DSM because they don't really meet the kinds of criteria that the DSM is interested in, right? They're not things that, for instance, are easily observable in the clinical diagnostic setting. But one thing that Kendler doesn't really focus on is the fact that this problem of indexing doesn't just apply to the categories of disorder. As I pointed out with the symptom of major depressive disorder, some of the symptoms themselves are also provided to us with indexes rather than with definitions. So in this case, we get this kind of double layer problem of indexing. So in that sense, I think we also need to deepen our understanding of mental disorders by focusing on the symptoms that are included in the DSM. So rather than just looking beyond the DSM, I think we also have to go through, as phenomenologists, for instance, go through the DSM and look at those symptoms that are not actually defined at all. Some of them are defined and poorly defined, for instance, and those deserve some kind of critical interrogation as well. But some of them, like depressed mood, are left entirely undefined. We're just given a number of indicative features like sadness and emptiness and hopelessness and so on. And all of those symptoms deserve kind of critical interrogation and reinterpretation. And phenomenology, I think, is the kind of thing that has already been used to some degree to do that kind of work, but can also continue to be used in that way. So that's about 20 minutes. I think I will just end there. But thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. These are random claps, I guess, because not everyone has his mic on. Thanks a lot. Very interesting presentation. And I'm opening the floor for, well, the chat for discussions. So we have 20 minutes. Well, just go on. And Anthony, if you could just pick up yourself as previous speakers, the questions. Thanks.
Yeah, Lily and Kenneth Kendler was the one I was talking about. He's the one who edits the perspectives in psychiatry, or what are they called? Philosophical issues in psychiatry books with Joseph Parnas. Okay, well, I'm glad everyone's agreeing, but it does make for a boring philosophical discussion. Anastasius, what do you mean by operational criteria for whom?
Can I unmute myself?
Sure, go for it.
Yeah. I mean, it is obviously it is very straightforward, and we can criticize all that. And I'm saying that as a psychiatrist and phenomenologically informed. The problem, I think, is, and many of my colleagues forget that, and they do what Candler says, is that actually the operational criteria, I don't think they serve so much the psychiatric discipline per se, but they serve, you know, the state, they serve the insurance companies, they serve a certain kind of, you know, structure out there in the society that serves other purposes, not so much some kind of scientific truth or something like that. So, but it is true that by repeating the same way of approaching something and not formulating around what kind of experiences you encounter, it then creates an image of psychiatry which is extremely poor in quality.
Yeah. So I think one of the issues here, I mean, to use that kind of ridiculous stop sign example again, right? The only reason I'm able to come up with reliable criteria for someone identifying a stop sign is because I know a lot more than that, because I have a really kind of clear, coherent conception of what a stop sign is and isn't. So in that case, as long as you have all of that underlying understanding, then I think it's okay to sometimes use indexing as a shortcut. And in that sense, using indexing within psychiatry is not necessarily a problem. But one of the issues is that for many of these disorders, we don't really have a clear, robust understanding of what the disorder is, kind of experientially or neurobiologically or genetically or whatever you know aspect of it you want to go for. And if we don't have that kind of underlying body of understanding and research, then it's not clear how we're effectively pointing to the disorder in the first place. I think in many cases, so for instance, in the case of major depressive disorder, I'm fairly convinced that that's just not one condition, right? The way in which those criteria are developed, they point to lots of different kinds of conditions that all get clustered under one common label of major depressive disorder and all then get treated in roughly the same way. So I think that an index without a really sound kind of scientific and philosophical foundation under it is a dangerous thing to rely on.
I totally agree with you. I'm just, yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, but it is what it is, really. I mean,
Yep.
I mean, if you have hundreds of patients, most of these diagnoses are given by GPs, not even by psychiatrists. As a psychiatrist, as a consultant in secondary care, I never really see depression anymore. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, someone else has already handled that before it gets to you.
Yeah, it's the GP that gives this diagnosis, and that can just, you know, it just goes into the system and stays there, and they prescribe medication, and they will never stop them, and it's a total mess. That's the reality.
Yeah. So I think I will jump on to the next. Chris asked, do you see Heidegger's concept of mood to be relevant? Yeah, so the whole other half of this presentation that I did not give was about the different phenomenological accounts of depressed mood that have been offered. And I think they roughly cluster into two broad classes, which I'll just go over really quickly. On the one hand, I think there's what I'd call a malattunement account. So those are accounts that conceive of depressed mood as a way of being attuned to the world that is, in some sense, negative or harmful or distressing. So those accounts, I think, are developed by people like Orthodox Heideggerians. So I think Kevin Aho, for instance, gives an account of depressed mood that's Orthodox Heideggerian in the sense that he doesn't disagree, I think, with any of the kind of core conceptual formulations of mood that Heidegger gives, and he uses that to then apply it to the study of what depression is. And then you also have kind of less orthodox Heideggerian approaches like Matthew Ratcliffe's approach, where he modifies the concept to existential feeling and thinks of things like radical hopelessness as a kind of characteristic feature of depression. But then in addition to those accounts where you think of depressed mood as a kind of mood or a way of being attuned to the world, there's also the work, for for instance, some of the work of Giovanni Stangolini and Thomas Fuchs and so on, where one of the core features that's discussed is this loss of attunement or diminished ability to be attuned to the world. And I think that often gets clustered under the same label as depressed mood. So I think those are actually two fundamentally different symptoms, right? One of them is a way of being attuned to the world, and one of them is an inability to be attuned to the world. And that's kind of like confusing a kind of sensation with being numb, for instance. So if that's the case, then I think we need to actually disambiguate that. And that might even help us, disambiguate different kinds of depression or different subcategories of depression. Let's see, Anna. How might the DSM create a definition that is both concise with this greater reliability and deepen and clarify, as in, how do we do this in small space on a page of a book? Yeah, so I think I'll go back to what I had said to an earlier question. I think my suggestion isn't that we need to fit all of this into the book itself. It's just to make sure that what's said in this book, what's said in the DSM, and the kinds of criteria we have are founded on some greater body of knowledge. And I think we like to pretend that they are. But in many cases, the kinds of criteria that we come up with are not founded on that. If we look to the history of how we came up with these criteria, the ones for a lot of these major disorders, like major depressive disorder, schizophrenia, and so on, the criteria that we use were developed and haven't really changed much at all from the original Feiner criteria that were developed in the 1970s. And if you look at the work that Feiner and his colleagues did, they just provided these criteria as preliminary diagnostic frameworks, and they had a whole system they had developed for how you're supposed to continually refine and develop and drop out some of the criteria and come in with new criteria. And they had this whole system of things like family studies and first-person reports and genetic studies and so on and so forth. And they had even the order in which.
Lost your sound, Anthony.
Yeah, continually go through and refine how these criteria are used and which criteria we're using. And the DSM essentially didn't do that. It just kind of reified those criteria, took them on, and just decided that those are the main ones that we're going to use. And there's been really slight modifications over the years in different versions of the DSM, but quite a few of those disorders look almost exactly the same as the Feiner criteria from the 1970s, and they were never supposed to look like that. That was just supposed to be a preliminary step. Let's see. Alan's observation, I feel that the interview schedule constrains the individual's experience to the confines of the questions asked. Similarly, there is so much crossover of symptoms within and across diagnoses and classification systems such as the DSM is fundamentally flawed. Yeah, to some extent, I agree with that. I do think that there are larger interview schedules that could be used. So it might be the case that we want something like the DSM for the initial attempted diagnosis, and then whenever there's some sort of confusion, we'll want some much broader interview schedule that we can fall back on. So for instance, in the case of diagnosing schizophrenia, you can fall back on something like the EASE or the EWE. It's developed by phenomenologists, where you have a much longer, it takes a lot longer to perform these interviews, and you need specialized training in order to perform these interviews. But as far as I'm aware, I think one of the roles of the EASE originally was specifically to provide resources for diagnosing some of these difficult cases when we couldn't come to a conclusion using things like the DSM. Richard, should we create a new phenomenologically inspired comprehensive psychopathology rather like what the psychodynamic diagnostic manual and leave the DSM behind? I'm not sure. Actually, the direction that I've pushed for, so I have another paper on phenomenology and dimensional approaches to psychiatric research and classification. So I'm fairly critical of categorical diagnosis in general. I think that sometimes it can be a useful shortcut, but I'm not really convinced that psychopathological conditions fall neatly into the categories that we're drawing, or whether I'm not even sure that they fall neatly into categories at all. So at least in the case of doing research classifications, right, I'm not sure if classifications that we develop within research will necessarily be useful in practical or clinical settings, but at least when we're doing the research, I don't think that we should rely on current diagnostic categories to frame studies. I think that we should instead use dimensions. So you would want to do a study on something like disorders of intersubjectivity, or disorders of selfhood, or disorders of affectivity. And within each of those, you could, of course, refine that even further. And there might be cases where we get lots of intersection, right? Lots of alterations across many different dimensions that occur simultaneously or tend to occur together. And in some cases, it might be useful to then draw a category around that for simplicity's sake. But in general, I'm not a huge fan of categorical diagnosis or classification. I think that it might be an ideal end product, but if we start with that, then I don't think there's any good ways to kind of step outside of it when we need to. Chris, patients experiencing depression often hope that we can give them a way to stop it, but we try to be with them in their lived experience, much as Anna was saying earlier. Oh, is that an elaboration of your accounts of your discussion with really familiar? Oh, no, you have something. I'll get back to that in a minute. Okay, Camilo, what type of framework do you foresee for phenomenology to deepen the psychopathological understanding? Yeah, so that's part of that work that I was doing on phenomenology and dimensional approaches. I think there's lots of different ways in which we can integrate phenomenology. So one of the good things that's happening right now is that so many psychiatrists and clinical psychologists are unsatisfied with the DSM and the ICD that a lot of people are looking for alternatives. So they're very much open to considering and trying out different approaches to psychiatric research, especially ones that will eventually lead to new approaches or new classificatory frameworks. And in that respect, the one that I've tried to align phenomenology with to some degree is the Research Domain Criteria Initiative that the National Institute of Mental Health runs, and that's one of these dimensional approaches. So in that paper, I use the RDoC Research Domain Criteria as kind of model for what, at least in some respects, a model for what a phenomenological dimensional approach could look like. But I also think there's plenty of other approaches that we might take. So I have another paper that's hopefully coming out soon in Lancet Psychiatry with Barnaby Nelson and Pat McCory, and that one looks at, it's just kind of a brief proposal for integrating phenomenology, not only with its dimensional approaches, but also with clinical staging, and then seeing how we can bring these various approaches together. So I think there's lots of non-mainstream alternatives on the table right now. And I think that as long as phenomenologists keep operating with this assumption that what we have to engage with is the DSM, we're not really going to make the progress that we should make. I think that there's lots of other approaches on the table that are already better than what we're getting when we use the DSM for a research framework, which we weren't supposed to do in the first place. So I think that phenomenologists need to start thinking a lot more carefully about which of these alternative approaches that are currently being used are ones that we can actually integrate phenomenology with or use phenomenology to enhance or inform in some way. So yeah, in that respect, I don't know if there's one approach. I think there's lots of options right now, and I'm not sure which ones are going to kind of win out, but we will see. Let's see, variant of about the total mess of the GP level. I am not a psychiatrist, so I don't think I can adequately respond to that. But I mean, just one general claim or one general, I don't know, something. I think it's already pretty well accepted that there is no such thing as like a focused treatment for depression, right? Everything's considered a fairly blunt instrument. So the antidepressants are only slightly better than placebo, and there's a few different kinds of antidepressants, but you can't really know in advance which kind, if any, is going to work for a particular patient. You just kind of try them out, as far as I'm aware. It's not like if you have these particular symptoms presenting in this way, then you should take this class of antidepressants as opposed to this one. So I think that that mess is already there, and it's kind of built into the approaches to treatment that we have in use. Okay, I'm trying to figure out which some of these are responses to my earlier.
Thank you, Anthony. Are you done now, or you want to address these last comments too?
Let me read the list here real quick. Yeah, I don't think I have anything specifically to say. There's last couple comments. Someone's typing right now. But if they have a question, I'm happy to answer that.
Yeah. Donna is typing, and we got 3 minutes. So let's wait what comes up. Yep. So we got the last one.
Okay. So what alternatives are you recommending? What alternatives are you recommending for a more nuanced approach to diagnosis and treatment, and how might a deeper understanding of a certain condition or misdiagnosis be incorporated into such a new system? Yeah, so, I mean, like I said, I think that there are a variety of alternative approaches that we don't know how well they'll work yet, but I think are worth trying out. And we have to figure out which of those phenomenology can be integrated with and which can't. And just because phenomenology can't be integrated with a certain approach doesn't mean that I would I think that it's not going to work or anything like that. But one reason for this dimensional approach that I've pushed is that I think phenomenologists already tend to think in these ways and tend to write and do research in these ways, where in some cases we do now find phenomenologists doing their research within the frameworks of the DSM, even as they maintain some kind of critical distance from the DSM, but you still have to use the category of major depressive disorder to frame your study, or the category of schizophrenia to frame your study, and so on. And I think that sometimes that can be useful, but I think it's a much better framework if you use the kinds of structural features that we've already articulated in much more detail and much more carefully. So things like intersubjectivity and empathy and selfhood and affectivity. For each of those concepts, these kind of existential structures, phenomenologists have already spent a lot of time unpacking what each of these is, what all of the different structural elements are. And the ways in which I've articulated this is that on the one hand, we can look at the modes of these. So like you could articulate what a mood is in general, and then you could look at different kinds of moods that might manifest. But then there's also cases in which the particular structural features of moods, for instance, might become altered or might change. For instance, in the case where someone loses affect or has diminished ability for bodily resonance or affective resonance. So I think that these kinds of avenues create a better framework for doing phenomenological and psychiatric research, which can then potentially feed back into categorical approaches, but maybe not. Okay, I think I'm done then. Thank you.
Thank you.